Harlem, New York. 11:34 p.m. Friday, March 16, 1945. The air inside Small's paradise hangs thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of spilled bourbon. The war in Europe is dying, but Harlem pulses with dangerous energy, soldiers on final leave burning through their pay, numbers runners working every corner, and women in silk dresses that cost more than most men earn in 3 months. The jazz band has just finished their second set. In that sudden quiet, you can hear ice clinking against glass, the shuffle of cards from the back room, and the low murmur of men discussing business that daylight never sees. At his corner table sits Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Charcoal wool suit, pressed to military precision. Diamond cufflinks catching the amber light. He returned from Alcatraz 8 months ago. But Harlem never forgot him. Every policy runner, pimp, and street soldier in a 6-block radius knows that table belongs to him. No reservation required. No discussion permitted. Across the room, Stanley Red Colson is 4 drinks past confident. Colson works as a collection specialist for Genovese family operations, a Navy Yard foreman by day, extortionist by night. He takes protection money from black-owned businesses and keeps a percentage his bosses pretend not to notice. Tonight he's brought 2 friends to Harlem, men who believe their skin grants them diplomatic immunity in any room they enter. Colson has been talking loud all evening, bragging about a shopkeeper he humiliated on Lenox Avenue, laughing about a restaurant owner who begged on his knees. His companions encourage every word, their laughter sharp and ugly in the smoky air. At 11:37 p.m., Colson stands. He's drunk enough to believe he owns every space he occupies. He stumbles toward the bar, deliberately brushing past Bumpy's table. His shoulder catches the edge, sending his whiskey glass tumbling. The amber liquid arcs through the air, splashing across Bumpy's lapel, soaking into wool that costs more than Colson makes in 2 months. The music stops. Not because the band sees what happened, they're backstage, but because every conversation in Small's paradise dies simultaneously. 60 people hold their breath. Colson looks down at Bumpy. He doesn't apologize. Instead, he grins, that particular smile white men wore in 1945 when they believed consequences were for other people. "Watch yourself there, boy," Colson says, his voice carrying across the silent room. "That's good whiskey you're wearing. Maybe you should learn to duck when your betters are walking by." Bumpy doesn't move, doesn't stand, doesn't raise his voice. He simply looks up at Colson with eyes that watched men die in Alcatraz over stolen cigarettes. When he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper, but it carries to every corner of the room. "You have 72 hours to leave New York. After that, every drink you hold belongs to me." The words are simple, calm, almost polite. But every man at the bar understands what they've just heard. This isn't a threat. It's a death warrant written in Harlem vernacular. Colson throws his head back and laughs, the big, empty laugh of a man who has never been held accountable for anything in his life. He walks out of Small's paradise at 11:41 p.m., still laughing, his friends trailing behind him like hyenas following a wounded lion. 72 hours later, Stanley Colson will be found in an alley behind a Brooklyn tavern, both hands crushed beyond recognition, his fingers permanently fused around an empty whiskey glass. Pinned to his jacket will be a note in elegant handwriting, "Last drink. Last disrespect." The story of how Stanley Red Colson lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to March 16, 1945, and understand exactly how one spilled drink became a death sentence. March 1945. Harlem exists under systematic predation. carved into territories as precisely as any military occupation. The Italian crime families, particularly the Genovese organization, operate with colonial efficiency, understanding that sustained fear generates more reliable income than sporadic violence. Their collectors move through black-owned establishments with the casual authority of landlords, inspecting property they already own. The police participate through strategic blindness, collecting separate tribute while ensuring no official intervention disrupts the cash flow. This arrangement has calcified into accepted reality. The cost of conducting business in a neighborhood where legal protection remains unavailable to those whose skin marks them as second-class citizens. The mechanics follow predictable patterns. A restaurant owner surrenders $75 monthly for protection against threats that exist only because he refuses to pay. A barbershop forfeits 30% of earnings to men who contribute nothing except their absence. The system operates with brutal precision, extracting wealth through carefully calibrated intimidation while maintaining the illusion of order. Into this controlled chaos walks Ellsworth Johnson, returning from Alcatraz 8 months earlier with nothing except reputation and a network of debts owed to him. Other men might have announced their return through immediate violence, reclaiming territory through traditional methods. Bumpy chose strategic reconstruction. He spent his first month listening, meeting with business owners after closing time, learning the architecture of exploitation. He attended church services and community meetings, rebuilding relationships with ministers and civic leaders who remembered when he protected rather than preyed upon the neighborhood. His approach centered on alliance rather than conquest. He offered restaurant owners and shopkeepers a simple proposition: pay him the same tribute they paid Italian collectors, but receive actual protection in return. The difference proved substantial. When Genovese representatives arrived at establishments under Bumpy's protection, they found themselves politely but firmly redirected. No violence occurred, no threats were issued, but the message transmitted clearly through the criminal ecosystem. Bumpy Johnson had returned, rebuilding his kingdom one strategic relationship at a time. Stanley Coulson represented everything Bumpy despised about the current system. By day, Coulson supervised loading crews at Brooklyn Navy Yard, a position granting working-class respectability and union access. At night, he transformed into a Genovese collection specialist, targeting black-owned businesses with particular cruelty. His method relied on racial humiliation, understanding that victims would endure degradation rather than risk violent escalation. 2 weeks prior, Coulson had cornered a restaurant owner on 134th Street, ordering the most expensive meal while loudly using racial slurs to describe the staff. He walked out without paying, informing the owner that Thursday meals were now free and monthly envelopes better be thicker. When the man hesitated, Coulson let a slur roll out slow and heavy, asking if he wanted his daughter to still have a father by Christmas. The room went silent. The man agreed. Another time, he visited a widow on Lenox Avenue whose husband's barbershop had paid protection. After the man's death, Coulson told her the debt survived the husband. He tapped the framed photograph on her wall, using "you people" repeatedly while informing her that missed payments meant joining her deceased spouse. She handed over rent money. He walked out whistling. On March 16th, both men operated in the same square of Harlem under the same ceiling. Bumpy conducted quiet business at Small's Paradise, his corner table functioning as an office where community matters were resolved. Coulson celebrated a profitable collection week, believing Harlem existed as his personal slot machine. The unspoken rules of Harlem nightlife were absolute. Outsiders could visit and spend money, but they could not create scenes, humiliate locals, or disrespect the men who kept the streets from burning. Coulson's presence violated every principle that made such spaces possible. His loud celebration, casual racism, and assumption that he could occupy any space without consequence represented fundamental disrespect for the social contract allowing the neighborhood to function. After the incident, Bumpy walked to the payphone outside Small's Paradise, dropped a nickel into the slot, and spoke 7 words that would seal Colson's fate. "Find out everything. You have 48 hours." The whiskey glass tipped at 11:37 p.m., and time fractured into terrified fragments. Behind the mahogany bar, Clarence Williams had worked Small's Paradise for 11 years, long enough to distinguish between ordinary trouble and the kind that reshapes neighborhoods. His hand froze mid-pour, bourbon streaming past the forgotten glass. He watched the amber liquid arc across Bumpy's charcoal lapel with surgical precision. This wasn't clumsiness. The angle was deliberate, the timing calculated. Clarence stepped back, eyes lowered, understanding that some moments demand no accompaniment. At the entrance, Big Jim Crawford had maintained order through 6 feet of intimidating presence and a blackjack that never left his waistband. When Colson's shoulder caught that table, Jim felt his stomach drop. He'd seen men killed for less, but never with such casual arrogance. His instinct was intervention, but survival demanded stillness. He watched Colson walk past, still laughing, and noted the exact time. 11:41. Details mattered when police reports were never filed. The regular customers calculated the mathematics of disrespect with absolute precision. In 1945 Harlem, where black men were systematically called boy, where dignity was stripped away daily through 1,000 small violations, the spaces where respect could be demanded became sacred territory. Small's Paradise represented neutral ground where status was earned through reputation rather than skin color. Colson had violated that sanctuary, transforming business into racial humiliation. The spilled drink wasn't accidental, it was deliberate assertion of superiority, the physical manifestation of every systematic degradation black Americans endured. That made it more than insult. It made it declaration of war. Inside Colson's mind, the mathematics looked different. His Genovese connections and white skin had functioned as diplomatic immunity through dozens of collection runs. Black victims had no recourse to legitimate authority. Police wouldn't investigate. Courts wouldn't prosecute white defendants based on black testimony. He genuinely believed Bumpy Johnson, despite his reputation, operated under the same constraints as every other black man in America. Colson had fundamentally miscalculated the difference between legal power and actual power. Bumpy's response demonstrated authority that no violent outburst could achieve. He remained seated, no raised voice, no movement, no emotion. That stillness terrified everyone who understood real power. Men who react immediately reveal loss of control. Men who deliver death sentences in whispers prove they operate beyond emotion. Every person in Small's Paradise watched Bumpy not move, communicating absolute confidence in his ability to deliver consequences without immediate action. Within 2 hours, the incident traveled through Harlem's communication network like electricity through copper wire. Willie Numbers Jackson pulled Colson's collection routes. Raymond Smooth Carter contacted Genovese sources to assess protected status. Marie Dutton, who ran the most efficient information network in Harlem from her beauty salon, began mapping Colson's vulnerabilities, addresses, girlfriends, family connections. Colson's night continued in blissful ignorance. He hit 3 more establishments, repeating his version with increasing embellishment. At each stop, alcohol loosened his tongue further. He bragged about putting the king of Harlem in his place, performing pantomime for anyone listening. He was buying rounds with the currency of his own demise, unaware that every bartender was already on Johnson's payroll. Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. Carlson woke in his Brooklyn apartment, head pounding, completely unaware that across the street, two men sat in a dark Buick. Thomas, the driver with patient eyes, made a notation in his leather book. Saturday, 6:31 a.m. Target is mobile. The dismantling began with surgical precision, calculated to destroy not just Stanley Carlson's assets, but his entire sense of security. Bumpy Johnson understood that immediate violence satisfied emotion, but squandered leverage. Systematic ruin, executed step by methodical step, sent a clearer message to Carlson, to the Genovese family, and to every person watching from Harlem's shadows. Saturday, 8 a.m. Two of Bumpy's men positioned themselves outside Carlson's Brooklyn apartment building, noting every movement, every destination, every interaction. Carlson moved with the lazy confidence of a man who believed yesterday's insult would fade like cigarette smoke. By 9:15 a.m., he had reached his girlfriend's apartment on Flatbush Avenue. Parking his pride and joy, a 1942 Buick Roadmaster. Chrome polished to mirror finish, paint immaculate, status on four wheels, representing everything he believed made him untouchable. At 10:00 a.m., the Buick existed as twisted scrap and scorched metal. It wasn't stolen for profit. The wheels were removed and melted into slag. The radio was pulverized beyond recognition. The leather interior was torched to ash. The message was unmistakable: nothing you own is safe, and nothing we destroy is about money. Flames consumed steel and chrome, while Carlson's wallet remained untouched in the glove compartment. Bills intact, but edges charred. Firefighters arrived too late to salvage anything, but soon enough to confirm what mattered: the destruction had been intentional, controlled, and surgically precise. No collateral damage. Pure intimidation. By 2:00 p.m., destruction escalated from property to income. Carlson operated 3 illegal gambling spots across Brooklyn. Back rooms behind delicatessens and candy stores where dice games ran without licenses and card dealers worked without oversight. Bumpy's crews moved with professional efficiency, entering each location simultaneously. They wore pressed suits and carried themselves like auditors, not raiders. House money totaling $2,847 was removed from safes and cash boxes. Players were told to leave, not robbed. Employees were lined up, handed cigarettes, and given simple instructions: this operation no longer exists. Go home. Find other work. No injuries, no gunshots, just sudden vacuum where profit used to flow. While Carlson's financial foundation crumbled, Bumpy handled the structural demolition. At 3:30 p.m., he sat across from Detective Arthur Hayes in a diner on Amsterdam Avenue. Hayes, a 20-year veteran with expensive tastes and flexible morals, slid a manila folder across the table. Inside, Carlson's complete criminal history: 3 assault arrests that disappeared through Genovese influence, current addresses for his mother in Queens and sister in Jersey City, bank statements showing $4,200 in savings, outstanding debts to a Bensonhurst bookmaker, and detailed profiles of every known associate. Bumpy absorbed every detail like a general studying enemy positions, then handed Hayes $200 in crisp bills. Information was ammunition, and he was loading his weapons systematically. The diplomatic offensive launched at 5:00 p.m. Bumpy placed a call to Vincent Gigante's operations manager, a man who understood that sustainable profit required calculated sacrifice. The conversation was brief and transactional. Bumpy controlled policy operations, generating $30,000 monthly for Genovese interests. Carlson generated perhaps $800 through small-time extortion and racial intimidation. The mathematics were simple and brutal. You can keep your access to Harlem's numbers racket, or you can protect a man who creates problems for profitable business. Choose carefully. The response came within 2 hours through intermediaries. Stanley Carlson no longer carried organizational protection. As evening descended, Coulson felt his world contracting like a noose. He called his usual Genovese contact. The number was disconnected. He tried reaching his collection partner. No answer after 20 rings. He went to the social club where he conducted weekly business meetings. The door remained locked despite lights burning inside and voices audible through frosted glass. Former allies crossed streets to avoid eye contact. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings were canceled through messages delivered by uncomfortable bartenders and nervous shopkeepers. At 8 p.m., psychological warfare intensified. A delivery boy appeared at Coulson's apartment with a brown garment bag and receipt. No sender listed, no return address. Inside, Coulson found a charcoal wool suit, identical in fabric and cut to the one Bumpy had worn at Small's Paradise. Professionally pressed, expertly cleaned, perfect in every detail. The receipt bore 2 words written in elegant script: paid in full. Coulson stared at the cloth with growing terror, understanding this wasn't peace offering or apology. This was reminder: what you damaged has already been replaced. You, however, remain expendable. Saturday night, 11:30 p.m. Desperation masqueraded as defiance when Coulson attempted to rally his crew for retaliation. He called an emergency meeting at O'Malley's, their usual Brooklyn stronghold, promising easy money and quick satisfaction for anyone willing to stand with him. He sat in the back booth watching the door, rehearsing speeches about loyalty and respect. Minutes stretched into eternity. An hour passed in crushing silence. The bar remained empty except for regular customers who avoided his gaze and spoke in whispers. Finally, the bartender approached with visible reluctance, eyes downcast, towel trembling in his hands. He slid a folded napkin across the counter without comment. Coulson opened it with fingers that had begun to shake. The message was brief, printed in block letters that sealed his fate. Your friend said to tell you, you're on your own. Sunday morning arrived with the weight of a death sentence. Stanley Coulson woke at 7:30 a.m. to find an envelope slipped under his door, the paper crisp and official, bearing the letterhead of a Genovese family accountant. No pleasantries, no explanations, just bureaucratic finality typed on expensive stationery. Stanley Coulson was officially green-lit. All organizational protection terminated immediately. Any consequences resulting from his actions were his responsibility alone. The signature belonged to Vincent Gigante's chief financial officer, a man who reduced human lives to profit margins and acceptable losses. The mathematics were ruthlessly simple and devastatingly clear. Bumpy Johnson controlled policy operations generating $360,000 annually for Genovese interests, with Harlem's numbers racket functioning as their most reliable revenue stream. Coulson's racist extortion activities produced perhaps $19,600 yearly, mostly extracted through intimidation that created community resentment and unwanted police attention. The cost-benefit analysis required no debate. Sacrificing one reckless collector preserved a partnership worth nearly 40 times his contribution, while demonstrating to Bumpy that the Genovese family understood business hierarchy. In organized crime, loyalty ended where profit margins began, and Coulson had become an expensive liability in a ledger that demanded efficiency. By 9 a.m., Coulson discovered that exile from criminal protection meant exile from everything. He walked into Murphy's Tavern, seeking familiar faces and sympathetic bartenders, only to be met at the door by the owner himself. "Can't serve you, Red." Orders from upstairs. You understand. The man who had poured his drinks for 3 years couldn't meet his eyes. 3 more establishments delivered identical rejections, each proprietor apologetic but firm, explaining that his money was no good anymore. Old friends spotted him from across streets and suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. His collection partner from the Navy Yard crossed to the opposite sidewalk when Coulson approached, pretending not to hear his name being called. The personal betrayals cut deeper than professional abandonment. At 11:00 a.m., he arrived at his girlfriend's Flatbush apartment to find his belongings packed in 2 cardboard boxes on the stoop. She spoke through a chain door, voice shaking, but resolute. "My brother called. Said you're radioactive now. Said anyone near you becomes a target. I got a daughter to think about, Red." The door closed before he could respond, the lock clicking with the finality of a coffin lid. Even the woman who had shared his bed for 8 months understood that proximity to him meant death. Meanwhile, Bumpy's surveillance network tightened with industrial precision. Thomas and Raymond maintained visual contact from rotating positions, documenting every movement, every destination, every interaction. Marie's information network provided real-time updates from bartenders, shopkeepers, and taxi drivers who owed favors or feared consequences. Coulson's behavior grew increasingly erratic as isolation transformed into paranoia. He talked to himself on street corners, checked over his shoulder every 30 seconds, and flinched at car horns. The city he thought he controlled had become a prison where every shadow held potential executioners. At 4:15 p.m., desperation metastasized into suicidal defiance. Coulson retrieved his service revolver, loaded all 6 chambers with trembling hands, and drove toward Harlem with the grim determination of a man who believed confrontation might restore his shattered status. He arrived at Small's Paradise at 5:20 p.m., weapon concealed beneath his jacket, rehearsing threats that sounded hollow even to his own ears. The entrance was blocked by 3 men in dark suits who materialized from the shadows with supernatural timing. No words were exchanged. No threats were issued. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, immovable as concrete pillars, eyes communicating a simple message: turn around or die here. Coulson's hand moved toward his weapon, then froze as he calculated the mathematics of survival. 3 professionals against 1 desperate amateur. He backed away slowly, preserving the illusion of choice while everyone present understood he had none. At 10:22 p.m., his apartment phone rang with mechanical insistence. He stared at it through 5 rings before answering, knowing with absolute certainty who was calling. Bumpy's voice carried no emotion, no anger, just the cold finality of a judge delivering sentence. "You had 72 hours. You have 72 minutes. The line went dead before Coulson could respond, leaving him alone with the countdown to his execution. Panic drove him to attempt one final escape. He grabbed his emergency cash and headed for Penn Station, planning to catch the midnight train to Philadelphia and disappear into another city's anonymous chaos. At 10:51 p.m., he attempted to withdraw his life savings from a 24-hour check cashing service. The clerk made a phone call, listened briefly, then returned with apologetic finality. "System shows your account is frozen pending federal investigation, sir. Nothing I can do." Detective Hayes had made another call, leveraging corrupt bank managers just as easily as street informants. Coulson was broke, isolated, and running out of time. He returned to his apartment at 11:02 p.m., all escape routes systematically eliminated. The revolver lay on his kitchen table beside a half-empty bottle of whiskey, gleaming under harsh overhead light. He watched the clock with the focused intensity of a man watching his own execution countdown. Minutes crawled past with agonizing precision. 11:15. 11:23. 11:29. His hands shook too violently to pour another drink. At exactly 11:34 p.m., 72 hours to the minute since he spilled that drink at Small's Paradise, every light in his apartment died simultaneously. Not a blown fuse or building-wide power failure, but surgical darkness that left neighboring units illuminated. In the absolute black, Coulson heard them, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching down the hallway, measured and unhurried, the sound of men who had all the time in the world because their target had nowhere left to run. The footsteps stopped outside Coulson's door at exactly 11:34 p.m., and he finally understood that the 72 minutes had never been a threat. They were a schedule. The lock yielded without splintering wood or breaking hinges. Someone had copied his key days earlier while he drowned his arrogance in Brooklyn whiskey. 3 men entered with surgical precision, moving through darkness with the synchronized efficiency of undertakers. No shouting, no struggle that neighbors might hear through thin walls. Coulson reached for his revolver but found only empty table where death had been waiting moments before. A hand clamped over his mouth while another secured his arms with professional speed. Within 40 seconds, he was bound, gagged, and being carried down the back stairwell like unwanted furniture. The entire abduction occurred in complete silence, witnessed by no one except rats and shadows. A sedan idled in the alley, engine purring softly, trunk already open. By 11:58 p.m., the vehicle crossed the Willis Avenue Bridge into the industrial desolation of the South Bronx, where screams went unheard and justice wore no uniform. The warehouse had been abandoned since 1943, its windows boarded, its purpose forgotten by everyone except men who required spaces where consequences could be delivered without interference. They positioned Coulson in a wooden chair under a single hanging bulb that created an island of harsh light in an ocean of darkness. The air carried the stale scent of dust, oil, and abandonment, a cathedral of forgotten commerce now serving as courtroom for crimes the law refused to prosecute. Bumpy Johnson emerged from the shadows at precisely midnight, dressed in the same charcoal suit Coulson had stained, now cleaned and pressed to perfection. No sweat, no visible anger, no hint of sadistic pleasure, just clinical focus and the cold authority of a judge who had already rendered verdict. 2 men flanked him like silent bailiffs, while a third, known only as the carpenter, arranged his tools on a nearby workbench with the methodical care of a craftsman preparing for delicate work. What followed wasn't torture for pleasure or sadistic entertainment. It was education delivered with the precision of a university lecture. For exactly 17 minutes, Bumpy spoke in conversational tones that echoed softly against concrete walls, explaining the economics of respect in communities where legal protection didn't exist. He detailed how Coulson's racist extortion created instability that threatened everyone's operations, how his public humiliation of business owners eroded the social contracts that kept neighborhoods from exploding into chaos. "You believed your skin made you untouchable," Bumpy said, his voice never rising above classroom volume. "You confused legal immunity with actual power. You mistake fear for respect, temporary intimidation for permanent authority. When you spilled that drink and called me boy in front of my people, you weren't just attacking one man's dignity. You were undermining the system that allows Harlem to function under occupation. That kind of fracture invites wild violence, rival crews, and opportunistic predators. Order requires correction. Correction requires demonstration. That miscalculation has consequences." Coulson tried to invoke the Genovese name, but Bumpy cut him off with simple arithmetic. His own bosses had already sold him for the price of Harlem's continued profits. Numbers didn't lie. Policy operations generated $360,000 annually for Genovese interests. Coulson's racist shakedowns produced perhaps $19,600. The mathematics were brutal and decisive. They had chosen sustainable profit over him. Now Bumpy was simply balancing the ledger. Then came the sentence. 2 men lifted Coulson's chair and carried him to the workbench. Forcing his arms forward and securing his hands flat against the rough surface, fingers spread like a pianist preparing for his final performance. He screamed, begged, swore, promised repayment, loyalty, anything that might purchase mercy. It changed nothing. Bumpy nodded once to the carpenter, who stepped forward holding a heavy mallet, its wooden head scarred from legitimate construction work. The punishment was symbolic and brutally precise. Your hands, Bumpy explained with clinical detachment, were the instruments of your extortion. You used them to take what wasn't yours, to intimidate people who couldn't fight back, to violate the order that keeps communities functioning. The first blow shattered Coulson's right metacarpals with a sound like green wood snapping under pressure. His scream tore through the empty warehouse, but no one outside would hear. Bumpy had chosen this location for its strategic isolation. Systematic destruction followed with methodical precision, left hand, then careful attention to each finger, reducing the tools of his trade to mangled wreckage that would never grip, never threaten, never collect another envelope. No wild swings, no frenzy, just controlled demolition of the instruments Coulson had used to spread fear through Harlem's business community. The carpenter worked with professional efficiency, understanding that this wasn't about inflicting maximum pain, but about delivering permanent disability with surgical accuracy. The final humiliation transcended mere punishment into permanent reminder. When the breaking was complete, the carpenter produced a heavy crystal whiskey glass identical to the one spilled at Small's Paradise, along with industrial adhesive used in Navy Yard construction. They forced Coulson's destroyed hands into gripping position around the glass, then applied adhesive with meticulous care, ensuring the bond would be permanent and irreversible. His shattered fingers fused to the crystal in a grotesque parody of holding a drink, ensuring that every person who saw him would understand exactly what transgression had earned this fate. The symbolism was perfect and devastating. The man who couldn't hold his liquor would now hold a glass for eternity. For the rest of his life, measured now in hours, Coulson would never hold another drink. The glass held him. Detective Arthur Hayes arrived at Sunset Park at 6:30 a.m. Notebook already prepared with the narrative he would file before lunch. He examined Coulson's ruined hands fused to that whiskey glass with professional detachment, read the note pinned to his chest, and understood immediately that this case would solve itself through strategic neglect. The official report, filed at 11:45 a.m., described the incident as assault by unknown assailants. Motive unclear. No witnesses, no suspects. Hayes interviewed exactly 3 people: the sanitation worker who discovered the body, a neighbor who heard nothing, and a bartender who claimed Coulson had been drinking alone Saturday night. By Wednesday afternoon, the case file was buried under 17 other investigations that actually mattered to the department. Within 48 hours, the Stanley Coulson matter was officially cold, unofficially closed, and permanently forgotten by everyone who drew a government paycheck. But in Harlem, the story ignited like gasoline meeting flame. Within a week, the incident had transformed from factual account into mythological narrative, with each retelling adding dramatic embellishments that somehow made the truth more vivid. Some versions claimed Bumpy had personally broken every finger while reciting the names of businesses Coulson had extorted. Others insisted the whiskey glass was solid crystal, a gift from Lucky Luciano himself. One particularly creative account suggested that Coulson's hands had been crushed in a hydraulic press at the Navy Yard where he worked, poetic justice delivered by the machinery of his legitimate employment. The details varied wildly, but the core message remained absolutely consistent: disrespect Bumpy Johnson, violate Harlem's social contract, and consequences would be permanent, public, and perfectly calibrated to the transgression. The real audience for this demonstration, extended far beyond Harlem's geographic boundaries. Every protection racket operator in New York received the message with crystalline clarity. Territorial agreements weren't suggestions, they were sacred contracts enforced through systematic violence when necessary. The incident single-handedly established what became known as the Colson Rule throughout the Underworld: conduct business respectfully, pay proper tribute to local leadership, and never mistake patience for weakness. Italian collectors who previously viewed Harlem as open territory for exploitation suddenly discovered new respect for boundaries. Genovese family operations began enforcing strict protocols for their personnel working north of 110th Street, emphasizing professional conduct over racial intimidation. The long-term impact reshaped power dynamics throughout New York's underworld with surprising permanence. The change wasn't motivated by moral awakening about racial justice, it was pure economic calculation. Harlem's policy operations generated too much revenue to risk over the ego gratification of racist collectors. Respect became profitable, and profit always determined policy in organized crime. Collection agents were instructed to operate with courtesy, to avoid public confrontations, and to understand that black business owners under Bumpy's protection were effectively untouchable. During the week following Colson's discovery, every business that had paid him protection money received a manila envelope delivered by silent messengers. Inside, each owner found detailed documentation of every payment Colson had extracted, dates, amounts, and threatening language he had used. Attached to these records was a handwritten note on expensive stationery: "This debt is forgiven. You are under new protection." No repayment was requested. No new tribute was demanded. The gesture demonstrated that Bumpy operated according to principles that transcended simple extraction, positioning himself as community regulator rather than predatory criminal. This distinction mattered profoundly in neighborhoods where official law enforcement functioned as occupying force rather than protective service. In the vacuum that America's racial hierarchy had created through decades of systematic neglect, men like Bumpy Johnson filled regulatory functions that legitimate authority refused to provide, protecting vulnerable business owners, enforcing social contracts, and maintaining the fragile stability. That prevented complete chaos. Small's Paradise transformed from ordinary nightclub into consecrated neutral ground where even rival factions could meet without fear of ambush or betrayal. The corner table where Bumpy conducted business became the most respected piece of real estate in Harlem, creating an island of enforced civility in a neighborhood where violence was otherwise unpredictable and ever-present. 6 months later, October 1945, a young collection agent named Anthony Provenzano received his first assignment in Harlem. His supervisor, a veteran operator who remembered the old wars, called him into the office and delivered instructions that had become standard protocol for anyone working north of 110th Street. "Before you do anything," the older man said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "go to Small's Paradise. Find the corner table. Introduce yourself respectfully to the man sitting there. And whatever you do, don't spill your drink." In Harlem, respect wasn't requested. It was required, and Bumpy Johnson was the man who collected the payment.